But I decided for this talk I'm going to do something a little different than many of them and sort of present it from a more personal perspective of my journey through this field and how it all happened. I've been studying the brain, both as a neuroscientist and a neurologist, for 25 years now, trying to understand how neural networks lead to higher order abilities, with a big focus on what happens to our brains as we get older, independent of things like Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. But my goal was really not just to always study the brain, but to do something impactful to really help people in their daily lives. And so for the first part, in 2002, my research as a neuroscientist pivoted when I started hearing a lot about this. Does anyone recognize what's going on here? You might have experienced this yourself. It's the horror of arriving at the refrigerator 7 seconds after leaving the couch, only to have no idea what you're doing there. This is also referred to as the senior moment, although it's a moment that we all experience. And I became very interested in this concept of an interference between our memory and our attention and our other abilities, and how technology is related to this. And this seemed like a really important area of research to understand the type of thing that people really notice impacts their life. It could be in a sort of trivial, fun way like this, or it could be in a very serious way, like driving a car and texting and all those types of interference. And trying to understand on what's going on in here that creates all this interference we see in our lives. And so I started studying this set of abilities that we call cognitive control, which are our mental abilities that allow us to interact in this very complex world that we live in based on our goals. And they include a triad of abilities: attention, our ability to direct our resources where we want them in space and time based on what our goals are; working memory, holding that information in mind for short periods of time to guide our behavior; and then what we in the lab call goal management, which is task switching and multitasking, and the reality that we often have multiple goals. And in the lab, we've been studying how these processes are emerging out of brain networks, as I described, using a host of tools from functional MRI, EEG, and transcranial magnetic stimulation. And our sort of unique contribution was coupling these tools together to understand the brain in a more comprehensive way. And we had published many papers over the decade that has passed on understanding the mechanism in the brain that allows us to do all these amazing things, some of the most human things that we do, really as a network property between the front part of our brain, the most evolved part, the prefrontal cortex, and the rest of our brain. And then in just as many papers, we've also showed that all of this gets worse as we get older, that it is just a vulnerability of the aging brain, and not just being in our 60s, but even throughout our lifespan. And this is where I had been sort of in around 2008. And then I would say my whole world sort of turned upside down when I started doing this, what I'm doing here right now. I actually found this slide interesting enough, had the same intro. I pulled that back from previous talks for this one, because when you present what I just told you in detail over an hour, like today I was at Columbia University speaking about a lot of this, it's fascinating to an intellectual audience of scientists that want to understand the detailed mechanism of what changes in our brains as we get older. When you tell this audience at an ARP meeting to hundreds of older adults that are actually frustrated by this, it's not really the best story. It's not the story that I wanted to tell throughout my life of how our brains just decline over the course of our lives and then like credits roll, everyone dies. It's just not that feel-good type of movie that I wanted to be a part of. And so it was this interaction with the public that made me realize that we are, and my lab and myself, we're not really accomplishing our ultimate goal of actually helping people. We're understanding something that's very important to people, but we're not taking that leap to really do something to better their lives. And so that brings us to the next part of the story. Around 2008, I started thinking about what we can do to use our expertise, our methodology, and neuroscience to really improve cognition in the aging brain. And I started becoming very interested in this world, this literature that had been emerging, showing that video games, in particular these type of games, perhaps the most controversial of all video games, the first-person shooter games, because of their violent content, can actually have a positive benefit on cognition in the young people that play these games. And not just all cognition, but particularly in cognitive control abilities, resistance to distraction, switching between tasks, attention abilities, even working memory. The exact same abilities that decline as we get older seem to be improved by these type of games. And that's true whether you look at young people that play them and compare them to those that don't, or if you take a naive cohort of young adults and have them play this game versus other games like Tetris, you see some of these same types of improvements emerging. Not to the same degree, because it's not as much exposure, but it really starts telling us that these games can improve cognitive control. And so the question is, how is that possible? And in my world, in the world of medicine and neuroscience, we think deeply about what is it about games that can potentially induce those types of improvements in cognition. And it really comes down to the basic fact that games create experiences. And this idea that they're just another manifestation of human mania, our enduring quality of going relentlessly after absolutely pointless goals. This is Time Magazine, 1982. Might not be all that games are capable of. Now, I don't have to really convince this audience of that. You've been sitting here for days hearing that very same thing. But this point that games create experiences is very critical for what our research involves, because experience is the gateway to our brain's plasticity, right? That wondrously complex dance of change that occurs in all of our brains all the time at every single level, from its structure, its chemistry, its function, all modifying itself in response to experience. And we know very well how strong this relationship is between experience and brain plasticity. Even witnessing a single tragic event can detrimentally affect the performance of your brain for the rest of your life, something that we call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So our challenge is, how do we create video games to induce the type of experiences that maximally harness our brain's plasticity to improve cognition, to refine our behavior, even to ultimately elevate our minds? That's the challenge that I was asking back in 2008. And the real critical idea is that games can be built as a closed-loop system. So what a closed-loop system is, they are already a closed loop to many degrees, but it can even go further. So a closed loop is where you intervene in some way, and you record the impact of that. You quantify it with as low latency as possible. And then you use that data to update the intervention and apply it again. Quantify, refine, apply, cycling over, optimizing, and personalizing at each pass through the cycle. We know, and engineers will tell you this well, that this is the most powerful way to change anything, whether it's a physical or a biological substrate. So how do you create video games as closed-loop systems? So I just want to give you this cartoon. So here's your brain playing a game. Now, while you're playing a game, obviously your brain is responding, and that is presented to the game as a performance. How fast you are, how accurate you are. The game can record this data, because it has all that information coming in, immediately, in real time, and then use it to update the environment, what we call adapt the challenge, in an appropriate way to your abilities. So you don't have to say how old you are, whether or not you have autism or Alzheimer's, or you're a high-performance athlete. The game figures out where you are at that moment. And then because it's adaptive, it constantly changes as you improve. This is the idea that we want to get across of harnessing plasticity. So the game activates a network in the brain selectively, because that's how the brain works. When you engage in a selective environment, your brain acts selectively. And then through this closed-loop system, which doesn't just involve updating the challenge, but also giving feedback in real time, we can put continuous pressure on that selected network to optimize its performance over time. And the idea is bigger than that, because we could use other new technology that's emerging that you're all aware of if you've been walking around here today, in terms of motion capture, wearable physiological devices, so we can gather more data than just how fast you are. We could look at your eye movements. We could feed all of that into the game engine. Now the game understands you even in a deeper way, and then we could use other presentation types of hardware and software to create augmented reality and virtual reality. There's been lots of virtual reality shown here today, to create even a more immersive, real-world, engaging environment. Then we can wrap all of this together with new advances in artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms, to create a truly integrated, multimodal, closed-loop system. This is what we believe will be the future of how we optimize the function of our brains, both when we are healthy and when we have deficits. So let's return to the story that I had started with. We had been showing that older adults suffer deficits across all of these domains that impair the quality of their lives. But because we had learned that these different abilities are really not separate, they're not isolated islands, they interact through common mechanisms of the prefrontal cortex and its networks with the rest of the brain, I had the hypothesis that if we built a customized game to challenge one of them, let's say goal management through multitasking, we would engender improvements in these other abilities. This is the transfer that we're all looking for from a game, to get benefit outside of the domain of the game. And so I reached out to friends of mine in the video game industry. They work for a company called LucasArts, right in our neighborhood in San Francisco. And I asked if they would help us develop a game that I designed to challenge older adults in this area that they are very challenged in, very vulnerable to the aging process, which is the act of multitasking. And so we developed this game called NeuroRacer, where you have two tasks, a driving task and a sign task. You have to drive as rapidly as you can on the road to not fall off the road, and so you use the joystick in polar coordinates. And you have to respond as rapidly and accurately only to target signs and not distracting signs. They're both hard tasks to do independently, but we have you do them at the same time. And what we do is we tether across these two games with the reward cycle. We've learned over time that people will tend to trade off if there's not a reward, and that reward here is leveling up. And one thing that we have learned is that everyone, including 80-year-olds, want to level up in video games. It's just a core nature of being a human being. And so we take advantage of that, and that's an example of how we weave together feedback and adaptivity to create a closed-loop video game. Then we went and did 3 years of research to show that we could use the game both as a behavioral and neural diagnostic tool, as well as a therapeutic tool to improve cognition. So what you're looking at here is the change in abilities to multitask on that game from 20 years old to 80 years old. And you could see this is not the type of ability that you just retain throughout your life, only to plummet when you're 70 years old in one tragic year. It's a game that it's a type of ability that sort of plummets every single tragic year of your life. So we now know that this type of ability, multitasking as well as processing speed, as well as working memory, are so sensitive to aging that they don't just occur when we're older. They really occur right after we sort of hit those peak levels of development in our early 20s. And then they decline very linearly across the lifespan. So this shows that how you could use a video game as a sensitive behavioral diagnostic. We actually found the only difference between two adjacent decades of life and their ability to multitask on the game were between 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds. So again, showing you how sensitive it is to pick up a difference between those age groups. We also challenged our video game developers to build NeuroRacer in such a way that we could record brain activity during gameplay, both either with fMRI or with EEG. And what you're looking at here, and I'm not going to go into detail on all this, it's just really an example, is the EEG activity, the frontal activity, the prefrontal cortex burst of activity that occurs in the game during the most challenging part, when you're driving along and a sign comes up. And what we showed here is that you can see the decrease in engagement during this continuous video game play between younger and older adults. Now, this we've already known. We know that the reason as we get older we have trouble with cognitive control tasks is a decrease in the robustness and the rapidness of how we engage our prefrontal cortex. But we were able to show it using a game. Then we had our participants take the game home for a month and show that we can improve their ability to multitask in the game phenomenally, even exceeding that of 20-year-olds on a single gameplay, and also show the change in their brain network, the prefrontal cortex, and its connections with the rest of the brain that led to their improvement. We showed that this ability to multitask better retains itself 6 months later without them playing the game again. And perhaps what was most important was that we confirmed our hypothesis. We showed that both their working memory for faces, very, very different than anything they saw in the game environment, as well as their ability to sustain their attention on very boring vigilance tasks, also improved. And they improved only in the group of older adults that played the multitasking version of this game. So a control group took home NeuroRacer and played single task version, and they didn't show any of these improvements or these transfer effects, showing you that it's not just video games in general. In this case, it was the active ingredient, to borrow a term from the pharmaceutical industry, of dealing with interference, of multitasking, that challenged the brain to the degree that it elevated the performance of those networks and led to improvement in other types of cognitive tasks that were not directly trained by the game. And we published this at the end of 2013 in Nature, which is, sort of like cover of Rolling Stone for us neuroscientists. And it was a big win, right? Because this is now 5 years after the idea of using a video game in this way to improve cognitive control in older adults. And I really bring this up for one reason, because if there's a game changer here, I don't necessarily think it's this particular game, although that game, I'll tell you where that's the path that game is heading along, and it's quite interesting, but rather the methodology. That you can work as a group of scientists with professionals from the video game industry and actually listen to each other, not just talk to each other. We know how it is when you bring experts from different domains together. And this helped that my friends were the video game professionals, and we respected each other and wanted to listen to each other to create entirely new types of games that can have a positive impact, and then do the careful multi-year studies that are placebo-controlled, that have physiological measures as outcomes, that look for sustainability and transfer, to really understand what the impact is. So if there is a game changer, and obviously only the future will tell us, it is that methodology. It is the working together of experts from different industries doing the high-level development and the high-level validation. And unless we do both of them, and if they're dissociated, I do not think we'll accomplish our goals. They have to be integrated together. We will be able to create this new class of games that can be a powerful form, induce powerful learning, either as an educational tool or as a new type of medicine. Since then, we have been taking this concept more broadly of bridging technology and neuroscience for positive benefits to the next level. And we built a laboratory in order to do that. This is our new neuroscience building in San Francisco at UCSF. And below on these panels is the Neuroscape Lab, a new type of neuroscience lab. Now, what makes it so unique, I mean, it's a high-level interactive media lab, but these exist at other places. But right outside these doors are 2 MRI scanners, a phlebotomy suite, high-end stress monitoring, eye motion recording, human-human interaction rooms. We can gather very rich data from different patient populations and then have them engage in our media right here in this room. I just want to give you a quick peek at some of what we've been building over the last 3 years. None of this is published yet because it's a long pathway from the early design phase to creating the game to then validating it is 4 years usually at the least. But this hopefully will give you an idea of how we think about game development and then the research that we need to engage in to validate it. So we have 4 games. We have more games in the lab, but these are the 4 that are the furthest along. We have a game called MetaTrain, where we integrated principles of concentrative meditation and mindfulness with our video game mechanics of feedback and challenge adaptivity. This is a game where the hypothesis is that by going through this adaptive challenge of focusing on your breath, monitoring what's going on inside your mind, and then recalling it to your breath when it moves away, can be used to better self-regulate internal distraction. This is based on a large field of mindfulness research. But here, we can use gameplay, and this was a collaboration with Zynga, the company who philanthropically donated engineering support to help build this out. So we're incredibly grateful. I think it's a very unique relationship between an academic lab and a game company with these real positive ends as the goal. We have a game called Rhythmicity, which was inspired by my friendship with Mickey Hart, who's actually in town performing tomorrow. He's the drummer from the Grateful Dead. And for his entire career, in addition to the powerful role that rhythm clearly has in music and entertainment, there is, thousands of years of thought that music can be therapeutic. And so our hypothesis here is that if we use the game dynamics that I just described to you and make someone more rhythmic, we will see an improvement in anticipation and timing, which are key neural processes involved in high-level cognition. So that's what Rhythmicity is. Virtual Attention is another game that we're developing with the help of Zynga. This game, it's our first virtual reality game to take advantage of the fact that in a head-mounted display, a VR head-mounted display, you have a very wide field of view and depth. And so it's a great place to build spatial attention. But we're not teaching people how to focus their attention in this game. We're actually teaching them how to broaden or distribute their attention, the type of skill you use, for example, when driving, that we know declines as we get older. Body Brain Trainer is a game that integrates demands both in the cognitive domain and in the physical domain. So it's an integrated cognitive fitness and physical fitness trainer. Our hypothesis there is that if you engage in a cognitive exercise in an embodied way, your endpoints, your outcomes, your cognitive improvement will be elevated compared to if you play that game with just your eyeballs and your fingers. And it's based on a lot of ideas, not the least of which is that physical fitness has a positive benefit on brain health. The really unique thing about Body Brain Trainer is that while you play it, the closed-loop algorithms adjust the cognitive challenge, just like it's true of all of our games. But in BBT, you also wear a heart rate monitor. So your heart rate is being fed into the game. Now, before you play BBT, you do a VO2 max, which is like the industry standard to figure out your fitness level. And we can find your anaerobic threshold and know exactly the range of heart rate that we want to target you. So while you're playing the game, this is a motion capture game. It uses the Kinect motion capture system. While you're playing the game, your heart rate is being fed into the game engine. And if it's too low, the game just automatically increases the amplitude of your movements, driving your heart rate up. If it gets too high, it could just titrate it back by changing the gameplay. And so that's an example how we could have multiple closed loops across the cognitive and physical domain, both putting pressure on different systems. Now that these games are completed, we do the deepest dive that I've ever heard of into what can change in your physiology, both your brain and other aspects. We do MRI, both functional and structural, EEG to look at timing in the brain as well as oscillatory patterns. We do stress testing, sleep monitoring, and now we're starting to do blood work to look at telomere length changes and hormone changes, inflammatory markers. Basically, if it can change, we want to understand how it does. Now, the ultimate win is not going to happen in the next couple of years as we do these placebo-controlled studies, but rather when we look at how they interact, something I call neuro-CrossFit training, which doesn't exist yet, but I promise you it will exist someday. The idea is that all of these games will act in some synergistic fashion that will have a benefit depending on the baseline performance of your own brain. And so what we want to avoid doing is what we've seen happen in the pharmaceutical industry and other areas of medicine, where strong silos are built around each medicine as if they're a holy grail. And that's not the way that we think this should work. So as we advance beyond looking at these games independently, we will be looking at how they interact together. One last thing is what we affectionately in the lab call the NeuroMan project, and it's the idea that we can train individuals and not just populations. And so I, as well as my wife who's here, has been training last summer on 3 of the games for 2 months straight, actually, on MetaTrain, Rhythmicity, and Body Brain Trainer, to understand from a first-person perspective. So, it's one thing to run a research lab, but to become a participant in it, I can tell you, is a very educational experience and an important one. And so the idea is that we could think about the N of 1, that we need to move beyond the population. We need to think not just about the games, but what aspects of a person's life do you need to engage in order to have them play a game deeply over a period of time. And so that's really our goal, is not just to build the games and validate them, but also to start to understand what are the steps that need to be taken to have it usable and have it really have the impact that we hope it will. So now I'm going to go to the last part of this, which is medicine, and that's how I was introduced. This is the pathway to FDA. So in 2011, which was running in parallel to what I just showed you, I became aware that in order to build an actual scalable product, we had to have the technology leave the laboratory. That we just were not positioned as an academic lab to build anything besides a prototype and an experiment to show that there's something going on here. But if we really want to build the type of game that will have its ultimate positive benefits, we needed to engage with industry. And so I formed a company, I co-founded a company with some of my friends, Matt Omernick from LucasArts, as well as a health care venture capital company here in Boston on the East Coast named PureTech Ventures. And we started Akili Interactive Labs so that the lessons that we learned, how scientists and video game professionals could work together, we could take to the next level. And so this company has now licensed the patent that I filed behind NeuroRacer that's owned by UCSF, and it's built a very high-level game. And one thing we've learned is that if you're going to build a game, and especially if you don't want to have violence in it, you want to target children, you do need high levels of art, music, story, all those elements that go into making amazing games. And they're very hard. You need to have experts from the field that have a strong appreciation of that. working closely with scientists to preserve the game engine. And then there's research. So this game is now complete. It's an iPad game, so it's much more usable. Also much higher gameplay, much more rapid closed loops. So a better game from every perspective, just from the video game perspective, as well as even a scientific engine to change the brain. And now there are multiple clinical trials being performed across all of these conditions. And most recently, starting at the beginning of this year, we began a multi-site trial for FDA approval, hopefully to become the world's first prescribable video game, in this case for ADHD. So that is the potential future that we're looking at as soon as next year. So these trials are ongoing. They are placebo-controlled. They're aiming for many of the same types of outcomes and even effect sizes as current pharmaceuticals, hopefully even with a better side effect profile. So that's where we hope this will go. It doesn't mean that this is the only route. We have interest in other populations like education and training, but this would be a real paradigm shift. Speaking to you as a physician, that we really don't have a large toolkit of things we can offer patients when they're suffering these conditions. So our goal is to see if we could get this into the doctor's prescription pad as an actual form of digital medicine. So while that's going on, in the lab, we're thinking, how can we take this to the next level? If it's really going to be a medicine, can we bring the effects beyond that of which we achieve by video games alone? Now, we love video games. They're not a magic trick. They activate the brain selectively as a network, and then through our algorithms, they apply that continuous pressure. But what we want to do is use other tools and methodology from neuroscience to boost those effects and create a new type of neuromodulation and new neurofeedback. In order to do that, we need to know what's going on inside the brain in real time. And so we've worked with many other laboratories and companies like NVIDIA to create this, the glass brain. And what you're looking at here is an MRI image. The blue is the cortical surface. The golden fibers are the white matter that connect different brain areas. And these colors, these flashes of lights, are the different frequencies of electrical activity in the brain in real time, just with a 0.2 of a second delay. We're even modeling how brain areas are communicating with each other, as you can see as those streams of light. And so what we've created here is a real-time data visualization of the human brain. So this is someone's brain in our laboratory during gameplay. You're looking at what's happening while they're engaged in a game. And so our goals now are to think, can this be a new diagnostic tool to understand how the brain is engaging, either in a positive or negative way, while being challenged in real time, not after the fact? And most importantly, can this be used to close the loop? And so I'm going to conclude by putting together everything that I told you into one slide and showing you where the glass brain fits in if we're really going to create a new category of medicine. So the year is 2016. You go to your doctor, whether you're 8 or 80 years old, and you have an attention problem, and you will get one of these. With the problem in that it's a blunt instrument. It's really acting across your brain in a rather non-selective way to the neurotransmitter system, but not to the underlying computational unit of the neural network. Thus, having us raise the doses to very high levels and getting just as many side effects as we get effects. We would hope that even over the next 4 to 5 years, we don't necessarily have to get rid of these medications, but just use them as activators in much lower doses, with much lower side effects. And then use something like an app that we're developing called ACE, Adaptive Cognitive Evaluation, to understand that person's brain, that individual's brain, so that you know exactly what game, or more likely package of games, you could prescribe to them. These games activate networks selectively. Through the closed loop, we put pressure on those networks to change them. And then the glass brain comes in. We could capture real-time neural data and feed it into the game engine. Now the game, the challenge, adaptivity, and the feedback is not just responsive to how fast you are, how accurate you are, it's actually responsive to how your brain is processing information, seeking out where those processing streams are deficient, and then guiding the adaptivity and the feedback to improve them. We think this will be like a gamma knife, like a surgical approach to optimizing the brain. This has never happened before, but this is an active research topic in the laboratory. The other idea is that we could take EEG activity and feed it into the stimulation parameters in a cap like this. And what this cap does, it allows us to stimulate the brain at different frequencies that match the frequencies in the brain. And we've already shown, and others have shown, that through this type of stimulation, non-invasively through the scalp, you can enhance the learning process to encourage plasticity. And so we have a couple papers coming out showing that if you play one of our games with brain stimulation, you can have better cognitive outcomes. And so what we wind up with here is something that is targeted to those systems that most need to be improved, that's personalized, and not just to the individual, but how they change over time. Multimodal, all interacting together in multiple closed loops. And because we always favor all this amazing new consumer technology, we finally wind up with something that's real world in real time. So as physicians, normally we take these very sporadic snapshots of patients when they come into our very stressful clinic environment and want them to perform at the top of their game. Now we can both diagnose and treat while they are home in their more natural environment. And so we are looking at how this type of technology can leave our lab and have impact in all these different clinical conditions. So this is not a wish list. All of these conversations have begun, and many of these research projects have already been launched. And then there's maybe even the bigger goal of understanding how this exact same technology can be used not just to correct deficits in those that are suffering, but as tools of wellness and education to help build young, developing minds. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.